All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, where you might be joining us from. I want to introduce and welcome you to joining us for Navigating Student Success Technology, which is going to be an overview of a step-by-step curriculum for minority serving institutions. My name is Meacie Fairfax, and I'm a strategy director here at Complete College America. And I've had the pleasure of working alongside the Ada Center and the Advising Success Network on creating and helping to support this curriculum. Now, there's a lot to be said about the work that has gone on here, and there's a lot to be shared that our presenter is going to be sharing with you today. But one thing I do want to note is that even though this is noted for minority serving institutions, that this can be used by any type of institution type, and that these resources, as you will hear, taken together, help to establish and maintain, help practitioners to establish and maintain a healthy technology ecosystem. And so with all that said, this is about the broader work that we do as partners to make sure that we are providing equitable student success for our institutions, for our campuses, for our students, for our faculty, staff, and others, and supporting that success. So all that being said, I'm going to kick it over to Brittney Davidson, who is going to be leading this webinar. And as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will be your steward and making sure that those questions get answered. But we're thrilled to have you on the line, and thank you for joining us. Brittney.
Great. Thank you so much, Meacie, and thank you all for joining us today. I just want to underline, though, that it says it is for minority serving institutions. So much of this work, as someone who has worked in technology, I can tell you, is so relevant across the field. But with that said, I have to offer a thanks to our minority serving institutions and access focused institutions who played such a big role in informing not just the content of this curriculum, but also the format in which it takes. So thank you all for your contributions, for your feedback. I think it's helped to make this such a powerful piece of work. Really quick, before we get into, my slides go here, before we get into the actual curriculum, I know all of you are pretty familiar with Complete College America, but just a little about us at the Ada Center. We are a small organization. We are the Ada Center. A lot of times, if you type in the ADA Center, you'll get something quite different. But we are actually named after Ada Lovelace, who is the founder of scientific computing. And we are founded on the belief that technology is not a silver bullet to any problem, but we do believe that with the right planning and implementation, it can be an incredibly effective way to play a role in advancing student success and equity. We tend to work with national initiatives like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Higher Endeavor Network. Some of you might know us through that, or through JFF State Success Centers. We also do a lot of research-based resources like the curriculum you'll see today, as well as some work on CRMs, as well as some research on student perspectives on technology. And then finally, we work directly with institutions and states who are in need of technology strategy, procurement, and implementation support. An important thing to note about us as well is that, like me, all of our staff at the Ada Center have a background both as practitioners and in tech. So my background, I started in the classroom and worked as a teacher, worked in ed tech for some years, and then also worked at the Aspen Institute with the College Excellence Program before joining the Ada Center. So all of us kind of have that dual tech and practitioner perspective on all of this as well. And for today's agenda, what we'll do, this is a fairly packed webinar. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking us through first the student success tech landscape. I know a lot of us kind of come to this webinar with a lot of different perspectives on tech, maybe a lot of different levels of exposure to student success tech. So we'll just sort of set the groundwork there. We'll move into a little bit of the research context and the curriculum overview. So that's a bit about kind of why we structured the curriculum the way that we did, where we got the information from, how you can use it on your campus, and so on. And then we'll spend the majority of our time on what I'm calling our module by module tour. There's a lot of information, a lot of different resources that are a part of this curriculum. And so we can't go through all of it, but what the tour should give you is a sense of what each module covers at a high level. So you can maybe focus your efforts as you're skimming through the curriculum, focus your attention on the things that maybe make the most sense for you or for your team. And it should also give you a sense of the different types of resources that are across the curriculum, because certainly we have things that are more kind of narrative briefs, as well as things that are kind of grab and go templates that you can bring into meetings with you. And then, like Meacie said, we will leave some time at the end for some final thoughts. We have a very quick 2-question survey that we would love for you to fill out that will inform kind of where this work goes next. And then, of course, we'll leave some time for Q&A. So diving into the student success tech landscape, just to kind of set the stage for all of this, I want to take us back to the early 2010s. We have come a really long way over the past decade plus in higher ed tech. And so if you kind of go back to 2010, this is around the age when, if you think of Amazon, Amazon was very much still kind of a digital bookstore. Netflix was still sending DVDs in the mail. And we heard a lot of language from Silicon Valley making its way into higher ed, right? So we heard words like disruption and innovation making our way into our vocabulary. And there was a lot of excitement about what tech could do in the higher ed space. And it was a little bit of a roller coaster from there. Certainly, there was a lot of success. All of us, or I think most of us, have probably heard about Georgia State, and they had a lot of success using technology to tackle racial disparities, to have double-digit gains in graduation rates and retention rates. And so certainly there's a lot of excitement after that because folks thought, hey, if I want to improve my graduation rates and my retention rates, I can just buy the same technology as Georgia State, and that should be that. Obviously, we know years later that that was not the case. Certainly, a lot of schools saw some success, but a lot of other institutions felt a lot of frustration. And the words that started to kind of enter our vernacular were things like initiative fatigue, a lot of cynicism around sort of broken promises in higher ed tech. And then kind of moving forward as we went into COVID, we certainly saw a lot of things like the learning management system taking more precedence in our conversation as folks began to realize that while technology can be frustrating, it can also do a lot of things that we as humans alone cannot. And so it is not necessarily going anywhere in terms of pushing and advancing student success forward. And of course, most recently, we've had continued conversations as AI has entered our space as well. So certainly we've come a very long way in the past decade and a half in student success tech. But what's happening underneath all of this is because there has been such an explosion in the capabilities of tech and the interest in tech, there's also been an explosion in the number of vendors and products in the student success technology landscape. So if you just kind of glance at this chart here, what we've tracked is since around 2007 or so, there's been now, I think, over 300 vendors, and I imagine that's actually growing to be even more with the advent of AI, that are selling tools that claim to support student success. These range from everything like student success analytics, chatbots, degree audits, a ton of different AI tools, student mobile applications. In fact, most institutions that we speak to have or are considering one of these tools. Many of them have dozens already at play in their tech ecosystems. And that can be a really confusing landscape to navigate. And what we've heard from a lot of our MSI practitioners is that while there's a lot of excitement at first about these tools, a lot of the practitioners we spoke to felt a lot of frustration as they were pursuing some of these grander tech visions. We've kind of categorized a lot of these complaints into, I think, 3 main categories of ideas. So one, we've heard a lot of, the features just aren't working as we expected. This VP of Student Success said, the demo showed us this beautiful student profile, but in reality, it's been really clunky. It's not showing me the analytics I thought it would. The other kind of category of thing we've heard is, our tool is working, but it's not having an impact. So we hear things from advisors like, I don't really use this tool. I don't really know why my institution bought it for us. It doesn't have the main features I'd really want or need, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. And these 2 things combined kind of roll into what we're hearing from leaders that will sometimes be things like, it's just been such a high cost. It's been 2 years. We've been trying to implement these tools. It's still not where it needs to be. The costs are adding up, and we have very little to show for it. Now, obviously, we don't want that. So one of the things that we did as we were creating this curriculum and speaking with our friends at CCA was to ask what is really getting in the way of technology supporting rather than impeding our student success goals. And the answer really varies from institution to institution, but overall, the pattern is that it tends to be both a sort of technology, strictly technical issue, as well as strategy and process challenges that are integrated with those tech challenges, rather than exclusively one or the other. And so as we were thinking about this curriculum, we thought, how do we work with MSI practitioners and access-focused institutions to really create resources to help move past some of these common obstacles? And so the curricular resources we'll go through today are drawn from over 6 years of research and input from MSIs, as well as access-focused institutions. We've talked to, I think, close to 100 2-year and 4-year MSIs in 40 states across the US. That represents over 500 college leaders and practitioners, including folks from IT, from IR, from academic affairs, student affairs. It kind of runs the gamut. And as we were talking to folks, we didn't only pull information about their own effective practices and their challenges, but we wanted them to really inform the topics that we tackle in this curriculum as well. And so the first thing we asked was, what are the most commonly asked student success technology related questions from across these practitioners and across these institutions? And we boiled those down into what has now become the 5 modules of the curriculum. And then the second thing that we asked is, we thought a lot about, there's a lot of information out there about how to think about technology, how to implement technology. And we wanted to hear, how do practitioners want us to distill all of that information resources into a way that we can answer those questions in an open source, flexible, and importantly, easy to use set of resources. And we were told over and over again that the easy to use piece was probably one of the most important, because oftentimes those of us who work at access-focused institutions, minority serving institutions, we wear a lot of hats, which means we don't have a lot of time. And so we heard we needed things that were very practical, not 20-page sort of research synopses, but really things that we could bring into meetings and make actionable right away. And so we heard you, we worked with you, and what we have today are 5 modules. And they are based around the 5, as I said, top level sort of big questions that came up as we talked to folks across the field. So really quick, I'll run through them. Module 1 is how can student success technology advance institution goals? This is like your all-inclusive primer for all things student success tech. Module 2 is, how does my college create a student success technology plan? And this is what gets into more of that technology strategy. How do we integrate the way we think about our IT strategy with the way that we think about our student success strategy, so that they are feeding each other and not sort of clashing with each other? Module 3, we get into, what do our students really think about technology? And this is one part research from hundreds of students. We asked them about every single technology category and they gave us our feedback. And then one part, how do you as practitioners get really actionable insights from your students on technology in a way that is equitable and fair to them? And then modules 4 and 5 get really into the brass tacks. One, how do we approach buying new technology? How do we handle procurement? And then finally, module 5, assuming we've purchased some technology, how do we effectively implement that technology so it does not become an issue down the road? So those are the really sort of high level topics. And what we'll do is we'll take a tour through them in just a moment. But first, at a high level, one of the questions we get is, who should actually be using these tools? So 2 answers to that. One is, at the start of each module, there is what we call a starter pack, and that gives you sort of a foundation for what to expect in that module. And on the first page, we give you audience recommendations in terms of who should be reading each, what we're calling sub-module, each piece in it. But beyond that, I would say sort of cross-curricularly, so as you're looking across all 5 modules, there's a lot of different ways that it can be used. As we've had people read through and test it, we've heard that technology procurement and implementation teams have found it really useful to pull these resources in as they are actively leading technology projects. There are IT and IR leaders and practitioners who have felt that IT and data have been really divorced and siloed from student success practice and strategy. And they're looking for ways to sort of speak the same language as student success practitioners and really bridge that divide. It's great for people who are non-IT practitioners, who are on the ground working on student success and equity strategies, and really just need some very nuanced, very detailed guides for how to lead specific meetings or which questions to ask vendors. as well as for institution leaders. Definitely some of our materials speak more to the high level strategy, risks and opportunities in ed tech today as well. And then in terms of how we use these things, like I said, we'll get a tour through the different types of materials that you'll see in the curriculum, but the materials are meant to be used in a variety of different ways. Some of them can be used really well for individual training. So say you are a person who has been voluntold to lead a EAB Navigate implementation and you are not super familiar with tech, but you know what your students need, you know what your advisors need. It's meant for some of those people to be able to reach out for some resources and get a primer on how tech works and how to think about it. It can be used for team PD as well as within active technology planning and implementation efforts. And so that's why you'll see so many different types of materials. So you'll have things like orientation briefs and webinars. There are facilitation guides that you can use in several sort of critical meetings that people tend to have across procurement and implementation. There are templates that we've taken from really effective institutions that have ecosystems that are working really well. And you can kind of copy their process for setting up a tech strategy, as well as what I've begun to call our grab and go resources. So things like a vendor Q&A cheat sheet that is 1 to 2 pages that you can bring into a vendor meeting, sort of just go down the line. And at the very least, you'll be covering most of your bases with that resource. Another thing is people have asked, do we have to do the modules sequentially? Do you have to do everything in them? No, you do not. They're meant, I think that they work really well starting from module 1 and going in through module 5. They do build upon one another. But if you stop and you say, I just want to zoom in on procurement, I just want to start with module 4, it's still going to make sense to you. They're meant to be used independently as well. So before we go into the details of the modules, Meacie, maybe I'll just stop here and see if there are any questions about the curriculum background. I saw a hand earlier. Check there. Okay, it looks like there is nothing in the chat so far. I will pause again at the end if there are any other questions about the curriculum. It might make a little more sense as we start going through it.
Yeah, and just to make folks aware too, I can see as you raise your hand. So if you want to come off and speak, we invite that as well. So just know that's an option for you. Thanks, Brittney.
Thanks, Meacie. All right, so let's dive in. So module 1, like I said, this is how can student success technology advance institution goals? And you'll notice each of these module questions at the high level are sort of very 10,000 foot. And that's because we get into some more of the details as you go into the modules. So some of the sub questions within module 1 include, what does effective student success technology actually look like when it's done well from both a student perspective and a practitioner perspective? It covers things like what are the categories of student success technology and how do they actually map to some of those products that we're seeing on the market. Oftentimes when we hear from people who've been to a bunch of different demos, they say, I've heard from all these different vendors and different products. They're using a lot of the same language. They actually seem like really different tools. How do we actually clarify what does what? And then finally, we have a list of other resources from partners like the Advising Success Network and CCA that you can also go to if you want to get deeper into any of those topics. So the way to kind of think about this at a high level is this is a really quick, no nonsense primer on student success technology. We've heard from individuals that this is really great as an orienting framework to student success tech. But we've also heard, and I thought it was interesting, that teams have found this really useful because oftentimes when we're dealing with student success tech, because of all of the marketing language out there, it can get confusing what product we're talking about, what products actually do, what good is. And so sometimes it's nice to be able to use this module as just a touchstone to have almost a common reference dictionary for what student success products are, what we mean by them. So that way we're all kind of speaking the same language as we work on these projects. And so a little sneak peek into what I mean by what you can expect in module 1.1. It's a little bit more reading heavy, I would say, than some of the other modules, but we've kept it pretty visual. So the first thing we've done is we basically talked to a lot of practitioners who said, I've seen a ton of different demos. It's really hard for me to piece together in my mind what stitching all these technologies together should look like if it's done well. And so we've done that for you in module 1.1, where we walk through how student success technology, in one exemplary case can look like if it's deployed effectively. And we've provided really visual, sort of generic versions of products and features that exist today, so you can see what they are supposed to function like if they're implemented well. There's also a few questions to guide reflection around, how might my tech ecosystem and the way that my practitioners and my students are experiencing it either align with or deviate from what is in the exemplar. Now, the exemplar is just one example of what great student success tech can look like. It's meant to be sort of one version of a vision. Certainly there can be others, but sometimes it's just nice to be able to start from a common point of what's possible. Then the sister module for 1.1 is 1.2. And so we go from what is possible in the exemplary sense to what does it actually take to make each of those technology tools work well. So 1.2 gets really practical about, okay, say I want a comprehensive degree planning system. What are the things that I need to consider ahead of time before I adopt that system? What are some of the people and process considerations I need to keep in mind as we're going towards procurement? And then as we move towards implementation, what are some of the things that we've seen that are absolute must-have implementation success requirements to make sure that whatever that product is, it actually works the way it is supposed to work within your system? So for example, if you were to go for a sort of an academic planner type tool, one of the considerations for adoption that we list out is, you need to really think about what are the processes that your team will need to consider to keep your degree requirements and your program information accurate and current in that system over time. So that way you don't install the degree planning system, and then as your curriculum changes, it's immediately out of date. A couple implementation success requirements might be, you might need to think about the institution-wide effort to really develop the program maps before we go forward with the adoption and implementation. Or we might need to think about some of the data access requirements for some of this tool. So that way we don't end up running into a data access roadblock halfway through implementation. So things like that. There's a checklist for basically every technology category. And it's just a nice little check as you're going through thinking about a new technology or implementing one to make sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's as we take on those new technology tools. That moves us into module 2. Module 2 is kind of our strategy and planning module. And it talks about how does my college create a student success technology plan? And if you're wondering what that is kind of the first part of module 2. The first part of module 2, we kind of talk about what is a student success technology plan and why does it matter? And the reason we've made this an entire module is because as we were doing research with institutions, we looked at which are the institutions that are consistently running up against battles in student success tech, are constantly feeling challenged or feeling like the ecosystem is not working for them, versus which are the institutions that have sort of a similar set of resources and capacities, but have somehow managed to make an ecosystem that works really well. And the difference tended to be that the highest performing institutions almost unanimously used some kind of student success technology plan. And so this module really walks you through how to create one, how to improve one if you have one already, and how to think about getting folks on board with the one that you have. So again, why does it matter? We'll talk about who should be involved in creating a student success plan. So who are those stakeholders that you should be bringing into that meeting as you create your plan or edit it? And then we get into the nuts and bolts of how to create that plan. So number one is the plan preparation. So that's where we consider the fact that none of us are starting with a blank slate. At least to my knowledge, none of us are starting an institution from scratch. And so the first part of the plan is how do we look at the status quo? How do we think of the ecosystem of tools we currently have and what the gaps are and challenges are and opportunities are within our current ecosystem? And importantly, how do we do that in such a way that we are bringing along all of the key stakeholders with us in that conversation, so we all have kind of a common understanding of where our gaps and challenges are? And then we move on to the plan creation and iteration. So then we say, given where we are, how do we ensure moving forward that our technology projects remain aligned to our student success strategy and our equity goals? So just to give you a sense of a sneak peek of module 2, This is the module 2.3, the technology and process mapping activity guide. So like I said, so while module 1 is a little bit more of a narrative, a little bit more reading and reflective heavy, module 2.3 is an actual activity that you can take to a team and do in a conference room. And this mapping process kind of ties back to that piece about preparing to plan. So getting everybody on the same page about where our technology is today and where our gaps are. And there are a few folks who have worked with us on these kinds of maps in the past. And these are some quotes from the activity once they did it. Folks were saying things like, gosh, I didn't realize we had 3 different appointment management and scheduling tools. Other folks were saying, wow, I realized there's this gap in our prospect tracking. We're meeting with all of these student prospects, or writing it down on pen and paper, and then I don't know where it goes. Somebody else mentioned we really need to examine how we are training people on Starfish to make sure we are getting the data that we need. And then one of my favorite quotes from this was somebody just throwing their hands in the air and saying, we have built Frankenstein's monster out of Scotch tape and bubblegum. So not the greatest insight there, but I guess helpful to know where we're starting from. And then this is just a visualization of how this looks when folks are doing it in person, potentially with some poster paper and some markers. As you can see, it gets a little bit messy. But what's nice is, wherever you see that red ink, that is something that now everyone understands to be a challenge, and we can start to work our way forward from there. I'll pause. I think I see a hand raised. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Meacie.
Yeah. No, not at all. I was just waiting for a pause. So Susanna Fowler actually have a question. So Susanna, I'm going to allow you to speak. See if that goes through.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a question. I had to press something by a mistake.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
Sorry.
But no worries. But there is one other question that I do want to put out there for you, Brittney, that came up while you were finishing up the other module, that asked about how can institutions get started in determining budget considerations and pricing out cost?
I think those sound like 2 different questions, and feel free to raise your voice if I'm interpreting them wrong, but budgets often come from the institution itself. So your institution your leadership or sort of whatever your resources are going to be determinative of how much you can actually work with. In terms of pricing out costs, I think we have in the curriculum some outlines of what major tech tends to cost, or tends to be a range. But one of the ways that you're going to be able to get really realistic about what it actually takes to implement a technology is to use some of those vendor Q&A pieces that we have to get really specific with vendors about not just what does the product cost up front, but also what does the product take to maintain, because there are also often licensing costs that come in year over year. And then what are some of the hidden costs that come with implementation? So a lot of times where we see people underestimating the costs of technology is in some of the prep work that's required for it. And that is in, I believe, module 4 or module 5, where you talk about the fact that there is going to be some amount of money you need to put aside for internal capacity to do things like work on your data hygiene, or to do some work to figure out what are the configuration requirements. In other words, how do you want this product customized to fit your institution? And all of that takes time, effort, and sometimes outside capacity. We have some of those costs outlined, I would say module 4 and module 5, but it really does vary by institution, because the vendors are going to price things based on how many of the features you turn on. Is it really robust, or are they more basic? How many students are you serving? And how much implementation assistance do you need? So I know that's not like a cut and dry answer, but I think that if you really do your due diligence in terms of talking to vendors and getting really specific about not just the upfront costs, but all the implementation costs, can go a long way so you're not caught off guard down the line, if that makes sense. This looks like an anonymous person's question. So if that answered your question, let me know. And if not, feel free to speak up towards the end of the presentation. And hopefully we can get to what it meant.
Yep, I got the side chat. It's you answered it. So thank you, Brittney.
Great, thanks, Meacie. Great. So module 3, we get into what do students think about our technology? And this is where we've taken our research from a couple hundred students that we've spoken to. We essentially walked through all the parts of the student journey from pre-matriculation all the way through post-graduation, and the key technologies that are used in each of those categories. And we asked our students, how are you actually experiencing these major tools? And we were interested to see, a lot of times our perception of what we think students will experience is not lined up with what students actually experience. So we have some of that research there. But then the other part of this module is also about how do you responsibly gather your specific students' feedback on your specific technologies on campus? And how do you do that effectively across the planning process, the procurement process, implementation, and as you continuously improve your tech? And so it's kind of one part, here's what the research says, and one part, here's how you might apply it at your institution. But just to give you a snapshot, module 3.2 is the webinar where our CEO, Sarah Zahner, walks through some of that student research. And what I've done here is she has it organized in the webinar by, I think, like student pillar. So each phase of the student journey and specific products. But what I've done here is I've pulled out some of the quotes that had to do with the learning management system, the LMS. So this is like your Canvas or your Blackboard. I'm doing that because I assume most of us on the line today have that tech. And what we heard from a lot of students, a couple of things that I thought were interesting were students talking a lot about inconsistent LMS usage. And this has become a much bigger and more critical issue in the post-COVID world, where we are leaning on the learning management system a lot more than we were before. And students have much higher expectations of it. So we heard a lot of students saying things like, all of my teachers are using slightly different tools or different parts of Blackboard, which was that school's LMS. The student said, I'm spending so much time trying to keep track of faculty preferences rather than learning new material. Another student noted, sometimes I'm caught off guard about deadlines since faculty manage them differently. When things change, it can be announced through email, or sometimes it's posted, or sometimes with the messages, and then I miss things, and that's really stressful. And so that's not meant to make any of us feel badly about what we're doing. But I do think that when we know better, we do better. And so one of the ways that we've seen people do better, sort of empowered with that information, is this an example of an institution that used some of the insights that we cite in Module 3 and actually created minimum standards for their learning management system. So they integrated some of that student feedback into their LMS policy. And these were not things that were rocket science, right? These aren't things that are astronomically difficult to do. They were things like, hey, one of our minimum standards should be to include clear expectations about how to use the LMS for a given course upfront, ensuring that the syllabus and the assignment calendar on your LMS have the same deadlines and test dates, and that if there are any changes, they are communicated and then updated in the system. Things like create and post a predictable cadence of assignments, and things like provide updated sort of grade and assignment deadline notifications. And what was very, very cool about this was the change we saw in the student feedback just from those minimum standards was incredibly impactful, right? So for example, students talking about the fact that when they can see a predictable cadence of assignments on the LMS, they can forward plan their own time, which particularly for access-focused institutions and minority-serving institutions, you might have students who are parents. You might have students who are working part-time. So being able to manage that workload and have that forward insight was really important to them. And then notably in the feedback, we stopped hearing things from that school like, gosh, I'm so confused. I'm really frustrated by the LMS. And we started hearing things like, it's really helpful for me to have a clear place to get answers about when assignments are due, how I'm doing, and what to expect. Right, so a really great example of how we can use some of those student insights to actually impact some of our technology policy or technology practices.
Brittney.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question from an attendee, and if we're misinterpreting, let us know, but I think this goes with the student insight piece. So what areas typically lead these initiatives, right, to get those insights? Is it assessment, first year experience, or individual academic departments?
There's been a range. So I'd say that for overall technology strategy, oftentimes there is some kind of technology steering committee on campus that can sometimes pull together students for focus groups that inform your overall tech stack strategy, right? So if you're trying to maybe create your new student success technology plan, it might be that overarching body that pulls in that student feedback. However, if you're buying a technology that is specific for a department or for a unit that really influences advising. For example, you might have a subgroup that pulls in student voices for that as well. So I think it kind of depends depending on what kind of technology you're using, and is it something that is part of the overall process of technology improvement, or is it more of a targeted tool and you want targeted student feedback on that? That said, because it can vary, one of the things that's really important, and that we talk about in Module 3, is being really intentional and planning forward how we even ask students to participate in that feedback process, right? Because we don't want to overburden them, and we want to make sure that it's as convenient and set up for them as possible. And certainly you don't want students getting requests for feedback from 3 different departments at once, right? So I hope that answers your question. It's a little bit of a mix, but I think most importantly, we have to really also think about the student experience, not just with technology, but also in giving feedback about technology, which we cover in Module 3. Cool. All right, so Module 4 and Module 5, this is where we get into, I think these are, Module 4 I think our meatiest module. I think this has the most sub-modules of any other module, because how we approach buying new technology has a lot of different components to it. It can be incredibly overwhelming. So as we talked about at the beginning of this webinar, there are hundreds of vendors. There are competing institution needs. There's a lot of urgency to do everything at once. And so this module walks teams through, here's how to put together an effective procurement process that allows you to select technology solutions that are actually aligned to your needs and mission, and hopefully not simply sort of ad hoc and pet projects throughout the institution. So we walk through things like, what does an inclusive and effective procurement team look like? How do we clearly define what products and features we actually need? How do we prioritize? And this is a big one, given limited resources. How do we separate fact from fiction as we explore vendors and products? And what are the major variables that should influence our product evaluation and selection? So as I said, a lot to really cover in that one module. The sneak peek I want to give you on this one, because I think it is the one where we see the greatest number of mistakes made, is Module 4.2, where we talk about how can I prioritize among competing technology needs. And the reason I think we see folks taking missteps here is not out of a lack of good intention. I think actually what happens oftentimes at our access-focused institutions is we feel a lot of urgency to take action and move forward on student success and equity. And as a result, sometimes what can happen is we end up running at all of the projects at once. We want to procure all of the tools at once and get it going. So we feel that urgency to change things for our students. But this can be a really huge mistake, because oftentimes those institutions end up biting off kind of more than they can chew. And 2 things start happening simultaneously. So one, like I've talked about before, none of us are working with a blank slate, right? So you will have your IT team that is working on dated legacy systems or other tech that you implemented last year or the year before that has ongoing issues. And they're really busy, so they might treat these as sort of like emergencies. They'll put Band-Aids on those things, and they won't necessarily have the time to do longer term solution planning. In the meantime, we're really excited about all these new tools, so we keep adding new IT projects and new IT projects and new tools to that list. But because there are so many of them, we can't give our undivided attention to any one of them. And so what happens is those new tools get partially implemented. Perhaps there's not enough user training. Perhaps we don't implement all of the features that we promised we would. And as a result, these new products then kind of move into this old product cycle where they have little emergencies, they require fixes, and we kind of just continue in this cycle of nothing quite moving forward, even though everything's being done at once. I liked when we were talking to a few of our practitioners, I liked this analogy. One woman said that it is very much as if you picture yourself on an airplane and you're getting ready for a really long flight and you have 1 bar of service on your phone and you decide to download 20 podcasts at once or 20 apps at once. What happens, right? You can imagine that little like download circle, just circling and circling, and nothing's actually getting to, maybe you have 2% of 20 of your podcasts, right? And the plane takes off and then you end up with nothing and you're very bored on the flight. And that is kind of what it's like in IT when we don't prioritize. And so in 4.2, we talk about what are some of the practical things I can do to set up some guidelines for how we should prioritize our projects. How do I socialize that across my stakeholders? Because we can make up all the guidelines we want about what we're going to say yes and no to, but unless we have the key people we need on board, we're not going to prioritize anything. And then how do we kind of communicate no when we say no for now on some of our projects? Because so much of this technology strategy is as much about what we say no to as it is what we say yes to. So a lot of module 4.2 there's discussion guides, there's some templates, there's some case studies around how to create that infrastructure for prioritization. And then as you go further down module 4, as we get into other pieces of procurement, there are also some of these, this is an example of, I think I mentioned that grab and go type resource. So whereas 4.2 is a lot of templates, a lot of guides, a lot of case studies and webinars, 4.6, if we skip ahead, gets us into some of these resources that are 1 to 2 pages, grab it, bring it into a meeting. So for example, this is a vendor Q&A doc that has kind of all of the main categories of questions that you might want to ask of a technology vendor, as well as a few sample questions as well. And so you can use that in a vendor meeting, or you can use that sheet to compare it to questions you might already have prepared, so on and so forth. So just kind of a range of materials there. Okay, so we are finally on module 5. Module 5 is how do we effectively implement technology projects? And I think that if we could have chosen a longer title for this module, it would have been how do we effectively implement and re-implement technology projects? Because part of this module is about how do we make implementation faster, easier, more impactful. But then we also spend a part of this module talking about how do we start to do the diagnostic to rescue a technology project that has gone awry. So just to give you the walkthrough of what those two pieces look like, module 5.1 is about how do we effectively implement a technology project. And we really start by thinking about what do we actually mean by implementation success? Because typically when we talk to people, when they picture a successful technology implementation, they are picturing the very last stage of it, that stage where the technology is totally set up, everyone's using it, everyone's happy, things are great. But the truth is the implementation process actually has a lot of success benchmarks in between. And so in module 5.1, we talk about what does implementation success look like at the earliest stages, right? At the mid stages, the late stages. And the earliest stages, sometimes success is just, did the features turn on? Like the vendor promised us that the feature would do X, does it do X? Right? As we move along, there are more and more features that we might turn on. And as we move down the line, we have to make sure the tool is being used correctly, and then it's being used correctly at scale, that it has impact, and then finally that it has impact at scale, right? So being able to track along those benchmarks also allows us to kind of keep in mind where our implementation is going right and wrong as we navigate through. We don't have to wait to the very end to figure out if we're doing okay. And then if we skip ahead to module 5.3, this is a little sneak peek of how can we fix off-track projects. This is our Ada Center Student Success Technology Mishaps Map. I've also heard it referred to as that thing from my nightmares from several CIOs. And the reason we include it is not to scare everyone, but is because we're often asked, how do I fix my off-track technology project? And somebody will say, the features aren't working, or it's not impactful, or implementation is incomplete. And our answer to that is always, it depends. And the reason for that is because, similar to is if I had a headache, that headache could be because I didn't get my cup of morning coffee, or it could be because I have a concussion. And the same is true for IT. You could have an IT headache that sounds identical to another institution, but the cause of that headache could be completely different, right? There's no cup of coffee that is going to fix my headache if it's due to a concussion, right? Similar to IT. The first step in fixing an off-track project is understanding why it is off track. And so through the mishaps map and through some of the guides that we have in module 5.3, we walk teams through how to identify what the specific root cause is for my technology headache. And then that is a good foundation to move forward to actually pursue solutions that make sense for my specific issue, right? It's not just a generic solution. And so I think that takes us to the end of our tour. And I'm just about on time. I'm really excited, Meacie. I was really worried about getting through all of that. But two things that I want to give you before we let you go. One, all of the modules and all of the content are available on CCA's website. Thanks to Kate and Meacie doing an amazing job getting everything up there. So there's on that link there. Two, one of the things, all of this material has been very practitioner informed, practitioner led. And one of the discussions that Meacie and the Ada Center and all of us are really thinking about is potentially where to take this material next. We've had a lot of folks come up to us and be really interested in having a more facilitated discussion about specific materials or additional support. And so, we are researchers at heart. We want to make sure we are doing our due diligence to think about if we do offer support around these materials, what is most helpful to you all, where should that be focused? And so there is a 2-question survey. Perfect. Thank you, Meacie, that you can fill out. It is the 2 questions are simply like which module is most relevant to you and your team. And then question 2 is, what is your level of IT student success fluency? There's just a kind of a rating scale there. Very simple. It takes 2 minutes. And that will allow us to keep you abreast of any opportunities that might come up with this material. We've certainly been in discussion about potential office hours or things like that, where we can get a little bit more in depth with some of your questions. But yeah, I think that wraps up your tour de force of the curriculum. I hope you all will take the time to skim through it, maybe zoom in and click into some of the things that might be most relevant for you, for your team. Send it along to folks at your institution that you think might want a little bit more background on student success tech. And then, of course, if you have any further questions for us, don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, I will pause. Please, please, please click into the survey if you want to stay in touch. Other than that, I will stay on for a few more minutes to take any questions.
All right, well, it looks like we're getting some claps, so a number of claps coming up. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. As Brittney mentioned, it is a lot of information to go through. So we're happy to see and hold the line for 10 more minutes if folks want to talk. And also as well, I do want to mention that on February 12th, we have, Brittney talked about kind of digital strategic planning. We have Dr. Dion Kerbeam, who will be offering a webinar from Coppin State, who has done a great deal of work with technology and embedding it in the way that taking in student feedback and the needs of the university. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me. I see people are dropping off the line, so thank you so much. Most of you have shared and stayed on for the majority of the time, so I'll pause and just see if there's anyone that wants to come off mute. Thank you all again. And again, this isn't just a one-time deal. You can reach out to any of us. Again, that's my email. That's Brittney. We work in partnership, so however you want to reach out to us, we will all hear about it.